In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at subject-verb agreement problems. But before we begin, let's do a quick review of the concepts that we examined in our last lecture. Last time, we explored the parts of speech and examined nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions. And as I mentioned at the beginning and end of that lecture, these parts of speech are going to be important going forward in analyzing our grammatical errors. For instance, in looking for subject-verb agreement, we're clearly going to need to know what verbs are. So words such as run, lift, kick, and swing are all verbs. In addition to these action verbs, we also need to be familiar with linking B verbs. For instance, in the sentence, the squirrel is outside the house, is a linking B verb. The squirrel is not actually doing anything. The squirrel is just existing, is being outside the house. Linking B verbs are am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. In addition to verbs, we also need to be familiar with nouns, because subjects are nouns. However, not all nouns are subjects, so we need to be able to identify which nouns within a sentence are actually our subjects. The definition of a subject is a noun doing or being acted upon by the verb. So, how do we actually find subjects within sentences that contain multiple nouns? Let's examine the following sentence. Kevin threw the ball to Steve. In this sentence, we should be able to identify the verb as threw. In order to identify our subject, we need to ask ourselves the question, who or what the verb? So in this instance, we would ask ourselves, who or what threw the ball to Steve? Here the answer is clearly Kevin threw the ball to Steve. Let's look at another example. In this sentence, we have the CEO is in a meeting with the regional executive of the company. Our first step is to identify our verb. Hopefully, we can identify is as a be linking verb. The next step is to ask ourselves who or what the verb. So who or what is in a meeting with the regional executive of the company? The answer is the CEO. So CEO would be our subject. Now that we can identify subjects and verbs within sentences, let's discuss problems that arise with subject-verb agreement. We need to be sure that our subjects actually agree with our verbs. A subject can be singular, or a subject can be plural. Similarly, a verb can be singular or plural. So we need to ensure that if we have a singular subject, we have a singular verb form. If we have a plural subject, we should have the plural verb form. When analyzing verbs, a verb is singular if it ends in S. We should begin to relate the terms singular and S as they relate to verbs. Now, please note that this is different than nouns. Generally, we add an S to a noun if we want to make it plural. However, with verbs, if it ends in an S, it is singular. So the plural form of a verb would not end in an S. Let's take a look at a few examples to try to identify what errors are occurring with subject-verb agreement. In the sentence, the executive often buy her business products from a wholesale store. First, let's identify the verb within this sentence. We should be able to identify the verb buy because it is an action verb. Our next step is to ask ourselves who or what the verb. So who or what buy her business products from a wholesale store? The answer is the executive often buy her business products from a wholesale store. So executive would be our subject. As we can see, executive is singular. There is only one. What form is buy in? Is buy singular or is buy plural? If we remember that singular verbs end in S, we should be able to identify buy as plural. Therefore, we have an error with subject-verb agreement, and we need to change buy to the singular form buys. The executive often buys her business products from a wholesale store. Now we have a singular subject and a singular verb. Let's look at another example. Timmy and his friends frequently calls their parents. First, let's identify our verb. We should be able to identify the verb calls. Our next step is to ask ourselves who or what the verb. So who or what calls their parents? Here we can identify Timmy as an individual who calls. However, it is not just Timmy, it's also friends who call. So for our subjects, we have Timmy as well as friends. Therefore, we have a plural subject. So now let's analyze calls. Is calls singular or is calls plural? We should be able to identify calls as singular because of the S. Calls, singular. So here we have an error with subject-verb agreement, and we need to change our verb. Instead of calls, we should have call. Timmy and his friends frequently call their parents. While these may seem relatively straightforward, it's going to get a little more complicated with the next few concepts that we introduce. So let's discuss how prepositions influence subject-verb agreement. Before we begin, let's have a quick review of what prepositions are. In the sentence, the squirrel is outside the house, we have a preposition in the word outside. Outside is a preposition because it shows the squirrel's relationship to the house. The squirrel could also be on the roof or above the tree. In each of these sentences, we have a clear preposition. Prepositions, however, always work in groups or phrases. So here you will notice that on the roof, outside the house, and above the tree all seem to have a similar cadence. That's because all of these are prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases begin with a preposition and then end with a noun. So everything from on to roof, outside to house, and above to tree is part of what we would call a prepositional phrase. So, how does this actually help us when we're examining subject-verb agreement? Well, with a subject and a prepositional phrase, we should know that our subject can never be within a prepositional phrase. So let's look at an example to see how this influences our analysis. In the sentence, across from the building is a park and a supermarket. Within this sentence, let's identify our verb. We should be able to identify is as a linking B verb. And we may think that building will be our subject. However, if we look at the very beginning of the sentence, we'll note the prepositions across from. If we know about prepositional phrases, we then can understand that everything from across from to building is part of a prepositional phrase, and therefore our subject cannot be any of those words. The only nouns remaining then are park and supermarket. Therefore, these must be the subjects of the sentence. So analyzing these subjects, we see that we have a park and a supermarket. Therefore, our subject is plural, and we will need a plural verb as well. So we will need to change is to are. Across from the building are a park and a supermarket. Let's look at another example of subject-verb agreement with prepositional phrases. The manual with the names of the products are out of date. First, let's identify our verb. We should be able to identify are as a being linking verb. The next step is to identify possible subjects by asking ourselves the questions who or what the verb. So who or what are out of date? There are many potential answers for this question. We can see that products is a noun and answers the question. Names is a noun that potentially answers the question. And manual is also a potential. However, when we begin analyzing the sentence further, we'll note that there are two prepositions, with and of. This means that there are prepositional phrases that run from with to names and from of to products. Since these are prepositional phrases, we know that our subject cannot be names and cannot be products, leaving just manual as our subject. We now need to see if manual agrees with the verb are. Manual, as we can see, is singular. Would are be singular or plural? As are does not end in an S, it would not be singular. Therefore, we need to change are to is in order to fix the error within the sentence. The manual with the names of the products is out of date. Subject-verb agreement can be tricky when we examine prepositional phrases. There is one additional item that we should be aware of before we proceed to a review of the concepts that we have examined so far in this lecture. Let's look at the example sentence, "There is a policeman and a lawyer waiting to see you." Our first step is to identify the verb within this sentence. This verb is a little more difficult to identify because it is split. The whole verb within this sentence is waiting. Our next step is to ask ourselves who or what the verb. So who or what is waiting? When we ask this question, it's clear that it is a policeman and a lawyer. When we analyze the subject, we'll see that we actually have a plural subject. We have both a policeman and a lawyer. Therefore, we'll need to change is to are. This example is especially important because it shows us that there, T-H-E-R-E, can never be our subject. Anytime that we see this word at the beginning of a sentence, we need to look for our subject elsewhere. With subject-verb agreement, there is a four-step process that we should be aware of. First, we need to find our verb. Next, we need to ask ourselves who or what the verb to find our subjects. We then need to look for any intervening prepositional phrases. Remember that the subject cannot be within a prepositional phrase. Lastly, we need to ensure that the subject and the verb agree. We make a verb singular by adding s to it. S is singular for verbs. Finally, keep in mind that there, T-H-E-R-E, can never be our subject. With these precepts in mind, let's begin looking at a few additional examples. First, let's examine this sentence. Both of the executives are waiting for you in the parking lot. The first step of identifying subject-verb agreement issues is identifying our verb. Within this sentence, our verb would be are waiting. We then need to find our subject by asking ourselves who or what the verb. So who or what are waiting? After we have asked ourselves this question, we need to look for potential prepositional phrases. Analyzing this sentence, we should see the word of, which is a preposition. This means that everything from of to the next noun, which is executives, is part of a prepositional phrase, and therefore our subject cannot be within that phrase. This leaves both as the subject of the sentence. Both implies multiple people, so it would be plural. Is are waiting singular or plural? It would be plural as well, so this sentence would be considered correct. Let's now look at another example. In the sentence, in the morning, the books about your topic was sitting on your desk. First, let's identify our verb. The verb within this sentence is was sitting. We now need to ask ourselves who or what the verb in order to find the subject. So who or what was sitting on your desk? Once we have asked ourselves this question, we should look for intervening prepositional phrases. Examining this sentence, we should see the word about, which is a preposition. Therefore, everything from about to the next noun, which is topic, would be part of a prepositional phrase, and therefore we know our subject cannot be any of those words. This then leaves books as the proper subject of this sentence. Books is plural, therefore we need to have a plural verb. Is was sitting singular or plural? Since was ends in s, it is a singular verb. Therefore, we need to change it to the plural verb were sitting. In the morning, the books about your topic were sitting on your desk. Let's examine another sentence. There is some cake and milk for you in the refrigerator. First, let's identify our verb. The verb of this sentence is. Now, let's identify our subject. So who or what the verb? Who or what is? Now, this question is rather vague. However, if we remember the precepts we have gone over so far, we are able to identify which nouns are actually potential subjects within the sentence. Analyzing the sentence, we can see the prepositions for and in. For is followed by the pronoun you, and in is followed by refrigerator. Therefore, we know that everything from for to you and in to refrigerator is part of a prepositional phrase, and that our subject cannot be within those words. We should also remember that there can never be our subject. This then leaves only two nouns, cake and milk, as the proper subjects of this sentence. Since we have two items, cake and milk, our subject is plural. Therefore, we will need a plural verb. So we need to change the verb is, which is singular, to are, which is plural. Hopefully, after watching this lecture, you have a better understanding of how to find subject-verb agreement problems and also how to fix them.